Imagine this: a massive cargo ship docks at a European port. Inside its containers sits a fortune, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of gold, mined from the soil of Burkina Faso. But the gold never makes it to its destination. No storm, no accident, no legal ruling. It is seized, confiscated under direct pressure from Washington. And then, as if to drive the knife deeper, Donald Trump's voice cuts through the headlines. If Africa wants access to global markets, it must pay its dues. In Ouagadougou, the news struck like an earthquake. That gold was not just metal, it was meant to build schools, hospitals, and feed children. To the people of Burkina Faso, this was not trade. This was daylight robbery. Crowds filled the streets shouting, "They steal in daylight and call it law." For a nation already scarred by decades of IMF debt and colonial contracts, the humiliation was unbearable. But humiliation can be dangerous. It can break a people or ignite them. And for President Ibrahim Traoré, this was no longer about one shipment of gold. It was about sovereignty itself. If the West could seize Africa's wealth so casually, then what future was truly in African hands? So I ask you, is this the moment when Africa finally says enough? Can a young leader like Ibrahim Traoré turn a wound into a weapon of unity? Or will the combined weight of sanctions, propaganda, and Washington's pressure crush his vision before it takes root? Stay with me, because this story is not about numbers in a ledger. It is about the dignity of a people. By the end of this video, you'll see why a single shipment of gold may have triggered a continental awakening. Please share if you believe you are among the first to witness this turning point for Africa's future, and subscribe if you know that truth matters more than headlines. The story begins not with whispers of diplomacy, but with the hard clang of steel containers stacked on the docks of a European port. Inside them lay gold, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of bullion extracted from the dust and sweat of Burkina Faso's mines. Gold that was supposed to travel across seas, enter markets, and be exchanged for the tools of survival medicine grain equipment for schools and hospitals. Yet before it could even leave the pier, it vanished into the hands of regulators. There was no court order, no criminal investigation, no accident of paperwork. The truth was simpler and far more dangerous. Under direct pressure from Washington, the containers were frozen, locked in place, as if they belonged not to a nation, but to a creditor. Almost immediately, the message was broadcast through the words of Donald Trump. His voice was sharp, unapologetic, and calculated to wound. If Africa wants access to global markets, it must pay its dues. In Ouagadougou, the effect was electric. The seizure was not just an economic blow, it was a wound to national dignity. For the people of Burkina Faso, this was not business as usual. It was robbery dressed in the clothes of international law. And it cut deep because the gold represented more than wealth. It symbolized years of labor in the harsh Sahel sun, promises of progress, and hopes that finally, after decades of foreign dictates, the nation could breathe on its own. Crowds surged into the streets, radios crackled with outrage. In the markets, women who had struggled to buy bread shouted that their children's future was being stolen. A farmer interviewed live declared with raw honesty, "We never signed those loans. Why should our gold pay for them?" A teacher holding back tears asked, "If they keep our gold, they are keeping the future of our children." Their words captured the fury of a nation betrayed. Inside the presidential palace, the mood was no less tense. President Ibrahim Traoré gathered his cabinet, many of them veterans of past negotiations with the IMF. Some ministers, cautious and fearful, urged diplomacy. Perhaps a repayment schedule could be negotiated. Perhaps compromise could release the shipment. But others shook their heads. They had seen this play before the West, demanding concessions in exchange for what rightfully belonged to the people. Traoré cut through the silence. His words were calm, but carried the weight of defiance. This is not about debt. This is about control. If they succeed now, Africa will never own its tomorrow. That sentence turned the room. For the first time, the ministers understood that what they faced was not a financial dispute, it was an assault on sovereignty itself. The seizure, as Washington explained behind closed doors, was linked to IMF conditions. For decades, Africa's loans had been tied to repayment in US dollars and backed by guarantees. The gold of Burkina Faso was quietly classified as collateral. To Trump and his allies, this was cold logic. If African nations were turning toward BRICS and India, then their assets had to be locked down before they slipped beyond Western reach. The strategy was ruthless but clear, yet what Washington considered leverage, Ouagadougou saw as ransom. On the streets, the protests swelled beyond economics. Miners marched from the goldfields carrying their tools as symbols of resistance. Students staged sit-ins at universities demanding that Burkina Faso break free from IMF dependency altogether. Even soldiers muttered in the barracks, if they can seize gold, what will they seize next? Western media quickly framed the story in familiar tones. Commentators in Paris and London spoke of instability, painting Traoré as reckless, too young, too dangerous. But within Africa, the narrative shifted. The people did not see recklessness. They saw defiance. They saw a leader refusing to bow when humiliation was demanded. The shock of the seizure was supposed to make Burkina Faso kneel. Instead, it lit a fire. What began as a single shipment seized at a European port was transforming into something far larger, the opening act of a battle over who truly controlled Africa's wealth and whether nations like Burkina Faso would forever pay tribute to outsiders or finally claim their right to stand free. If the seizure of gold was meant to frighten Burkina Faso into obedience, it had the opposite effect. Outrage spread through Ouagadougou like wildfire. From dusty villages to crowded markets, from lecture halls to military barracks, one truth became impossible to deny: Africa's sovereignty was under siege. Mothers shouted in the breadlines, "Whose gold? Is it ours or theirs?" Youths scrawled slogans on cardboard. "Our gold is not your guarantee." Miners, their faces blackened with dust, marched into the capital holding their pickaxes aloft, not as tools of labor, but as weapons of symbolism. It was no longer about bullion sealed in steel containers. It was about dignity, about who had the right to decide Africa's future. Inside the presidential palace, the tension rose. Traoré convened his closest advisors. Some argued for compromise, repayment schedules, negotiations, diplomatic appeals. But others shook their heads, weary of repeating the same cycle of surrender. Then Traoré stood. His voice cut through the uncertainty with steel. "They want us to bow. They want us to pay debts we did not choose with gold, we have mined with our blood. If we bend today, there will be nothing left to stand on tomorrow." Those words carried like a spark through dry grass. Ministers who had hesitated found themselves nodding. Soldiers who had grumbled in silence felt their pride rekindled. Students whispered the line in dormitories until it became a chant. For the first time, it was clear this was not a financial dispute. It was a war for sovereignty. The West, however, doubled down. Washington officials insisted that the seizure was compliance with financial law. European media framed Traoré as reckless, suggesting Burkina Faso's young leader was gambling with his country's survival. Yet their narratives could not drown out the sound on the streets of Africa. The more Western voices condemned him, the more ordinary people rallied to his side. Then came the turning point, the spark that transformed fury into strategy. At an emergency session with leaders of the Alliance of Sahel States, Traoré spoke with the bluntness of a soldier. "They are holding our gold because they know it is our strength. They call it collateral. I call it ransom. And if we accept this ransom, it will never end." The room fell into silence. For years, such ideas had been dismissed as fantasy. But in that silence, a radical thought emerged. Mali's representative broke it first. What if we stop sending gold through their ports? What if we keep it here in Africa, heads turned, eyes widened? For the first time, the possibility of an African gold reserve, a vault built and guarded on African soil beyond the reach of Paris, Brussels, or Washington, was placed on the table. The idea spread like electricity. Protesters no longer demanded only the release of seized gold. They demanded change. Students painted murals of gold bars breaking free from chains. Farmers pledged to donate harvests to support a people's fund. On radio call-ins, villagers asked how soon Africa could build its own vaults. Western governments scoffed. A European official dismissed the idea as dangerous populism, predicting disaster if Africa tried to bypass the IMF. Yet, their very condemnation gave the project legitimacy. If the West feared it this much, then surely it was worth pursuing. And then the cauldron boiled over. Leaked documents from a European bank confirmed what many had long suspected: the seizure had not been a neutral act of regulation. It was ordered under direct pressure from Washington, with instructions to classify African gold as collateral for IMF debts. The memos were damning, even arrogant. One line read, "Without control of their gold, IMF leverage will collapse. This cannot be allowed. The effect was explosive. African media plastered headlines, "Our gold, their debt." Radio hosts thundered, "They steal and call it justice." In Ouagadougou, tens of thousands filled Independence Square. Farmers held up baskets of grain, miners lifted their tools, students unfurled banners declaring "Our gold is our freedom." What was meant as humiliation had backfired spectacularly. The seizure of gold had united a nation, and increasingly a continent. For the first time in generations, Africans were not simply reacting to Western dictates, they were planning for themselves. And at the center of this storm stood Ibrahim Traoré. To Washington, he was reckless. To Paris, he was dangerous. But to the people shouting in the streets, he was something else entirely, the voice of defiance they had been waiting for. The fire that began with the seizure of a single shipment of gold did not remain confined to Burkina Faso. It spilled into every corner of the Sahel, reshaping the political and social fabric of entire nations. On the streets of Ouagadougou, protests that began as spontaneous rallies hardened into organized movements. Neighborhoods formed committees, students held campus assemblies, miners created councils of resistance. It was no longer just about demanding the return of seized gold. It was about demanding a new system. One young student leader declared, "If our future is locked in their vaults, then we will build our own." His words captured the essence of what was happening. Civil society, long fragmented by poverty and fear, found itself galvanized. Mothers who once lined up silently for bread began speaking with fury on radio call-in shows. Farmers, weary from years of drought and debt, pledged portions of their harvest to support a sovereignty fund. Even shopkeepers in dusty towns painted signs above their stalls, "Our gold, our Africa." The humiliation that was meant to weaken them had instead created a bond of solidarity. Inside government halls, the consequences were just as profound. President Ibrahim Traoré convened a historic meeting with leaders from Mali and Niger. Together, they debated the unthinkable, constructing an African gold reserve on African soil, protected by African soldiers and managed by African economists. For decades, such discussions had been dismissed as naive. Now, after the theft at a European port, the idea sounded less like fantasy and more like survival. Not everyone agreed. Some ministers warned that breaking with the IMF would trigger crippling sanctions. They argued that without Western insurance, African exports would collapse. Yet others countered that dependence itself was the greater chain. Did sanctions ever feed our people? One delegate asked. Did frozen reserves ever build our schools? The debate was fierce, but it revealed a new courage. Leaders were willing to question the very foundations of the global system. As these conversations unfolded, Western governments escalated their pressure. Banks in Paris and Brussels froze transactions linked to Burkina Faso. Insurance companies refused to cover shipments bound for Sahel nations. Even humanitarian aid deliveries were delayed under the guise of compliance checks. It was economic warfare cloaked in bureaucratic language. But instead of shattering morale, the measures deepened resolve. In Ouagadougou, volunteers organized food cooperatives to ease shortages. Farmers pooled grain into community warehouses. Students launched online campaigns turning "Keep the Gold, Build the Vault" into a viral slogan across Africa. Each sanction, each insult seemed only to reinforce the determination that Africa must chart its own path. Politically, the crisis redrew alliances. The alliance of Sahel states grew tighter, no longer just a regional bloc, but the nucleus of a larger continental movement. Guinea offered to channel its bauxite revenues into the project. Rumors spread that even nations outside the Sahel were considering participation. For the first time, leaders spoke not of competing for Western approval, but of defending a shared African destiny. And then there was the army. Traditionally cautious, often caught between loyalty to the state and the allure of foreign patronage, the military now made its stance clear. High-ranking officers issued a rare joint statement: "Our loyalty is to the Republic, not to foreign hands." The message reverberated through the barracks, assuring citizens that this was not merely a political gamble, but a national stand. For ordinary people, the consequences were tangible. Prices of imported goods rose, shortages appeared in markets, and rumors of new sanctions circulated daily. Yet the hardship did not fracture society. Instead, it fed a deeper sense of unity. Farmers saw their sacrifice as planting seeds for freedom. Miners carried on their work with a new sense of mission. Teachers told children that their suffering was part of a larger story, that of a nation reclaiming its dignity. Thus, what began as a single humiliation had evolved into a civil and political awakening. The gold may have been seized abroad, but within Africa something far more valuable was being forged: solidarity, courage, and the conviction that sovereignty was not negotiable. From Washington's perspective, the seizure of Burkina Faso's gold was a calculated move, a reminder that global trade operates under rules written in Western capitals. Donald Trump made that message explicit. At a press conference, he declared, "These young leaders think they can defy the rules. But if Africa wants to sit at the table of global trade, it must first learn to follow the law." For him, the law meant IMF contracts and dollar supremacy. Anything else was framed as chaos. American analysts echoed this line. On major networks, commentators painted Ibrahim Traoré as reckless, untested, even dangerous. They argued that his defiance would lead Burkina Faso to famine and collapse. Some described the proposed African gold reserve as a fantasy, a populist stunt with no foundation in economics. Yet beneath the rhetoric, internal memos leaked from European banks told a different story. Washington and Brussels feared not Traoré's inexperience, but his determination. If African gold slipped beyond their reach, IMF leverage across the continent could crumble. In Europe, the tone was equally dismissive. Financial newspapers warned of dangerous populism, predicting that Africa's experiment would spook investors and destabilize markets. Officials in Paris and Brussels quietly debated sanctions, convinced that hardship would eventually break public support. What they underestimated was the power of symbolism. For every headline mocking the idea of an African vault, murals of gold bars breaking free from chains appeared on walls from Dakar to Bamako. Meanwhile, the global south was watching closely. In Moscow, Beijing, and New Delhi, the story was not seen as recklessness, but as opportunity. Within weeks, envoys arrived in Ouagadougou with quiet offers, direct gold purchases, refining technology, and most importantly, markets immune to Washington's pressure. For the first time in modern history, Burkina Faso and its allies had alternatives beyond Europe's ports and America's banks. The United Nations debated the crisis in hushed tones. Western diplomats argued that Burkina Faso's defiance undermined international financial stability. But African representatives pushed back, asking why their resources should be treated as collateral for debts written under colonial conditions. The tension revealed a deeper fault line: one world clinging to old hierarchies, another daring to rewrite the rules. Even in the United States, cracks began to show. Independent commentators and some members of Congress questioned the wisdom of using financial coercion against one of the world's poorest nations. If this is about justice, one critic asked, why are we punishing farmers and schoolchildren for debts they never signed? The question resonated far beyond Africa. For many Americans weary of endless wars and economic inequality at home, the spectacle of seizing gold from a struggling nation felt like a mirror of their own struggles with power and exploitation. Across Africa, the reaction was overwhelmingly different. Leaders who had once hesitated now leaned in. Mali pledged support. Niger spoke of using uranium revenues to strengthen the reserve. Guinea hinted at channeling bauxite profits into the same system. What was once a Burkina Faso crisis was becoming a continental movement. In this clash of perspectives, the West saw danger, instability, and lost control. The global South saw courage, opportunity, and the birth of a new order. And in the middle of it all stood Ibrahim Traoré, no longer just the president of a small, landlocked nation, but the symbol of a continent's defiance against a system that had bound it for generations. Burkina Faso never recovered the gold seized at that European port. The bullion remained locked away, counted not as national wealth, but as collateral for debts imposed decades ago. Yet, what was taken by force gave birth to something far greater. From the dust of humiliation rose an idea, an African gold reserve born not in the marble halls of Washington or Paris, but in the voices of miners, farmers, students, and soldiers who refused to bow. President Ibrahim Traoré stood before his people and declared, "They thought our gold was collateral, but it is not collateral. It is freedom. And freedom does not beg, it builds." His words echoed far beyond Ouagadougou. They became a rallying cry across the Sahel, a reminder that sovereignty is not given. It is seized and defended. But the warning is clear. The West has not abandoned its grip. Financial sanctions, covert funding of opposition, and psychological warfare continue. And as history shows, when power feels threatened, it does not retreat quietly. What began with seized gold may escalate into deeper confrontations, economic, political, even military. So the question remains, can Africa sustain this defiance? Can leaders like Ibrahim Traoré transform a moment of resistance into a durable system of independence, or will pressure, division, and betrayal succeed where brute force has failed? I leave that question with you. Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's strategies are truly effective yet, or is Africa still searching for a leader who can carry this fight to the end? Please share if you believe you are among the first to witness this historic turning point. And subscribe if you know that the truth is always more important than the headlines. Because the battle over one shipment of gold is not just about Burkina Faso. It is about the future of Africa itself.